here we are, the granddaddy of all quantum weirdness, the infamous double-slit experiment. To understand this experiment, we first need to see how particles, or little balls of matter, act. If we randomly shoot a small object, say a marble, at the screen, we see a pattern on the back wall where they went through the slit and hit. Now, if we add a second slit, we would expect to see a second band duplicated to the right. Now, let's look at waves. The waves hit the slit and radiate out, striking the back wall with the most intensity directly in line with the slit. The line of brightness on the back screen shows that intensity. This is similar to the line the marbles make. But when we add the second slit, something different happens. If the top of one wave meets the bottom of another wave, they cancel each other out. So now there is an interference pattern on the back wall. Places where the two tops meet are the highest intensity, the bright lines, and where they cancel, there is nothing. So, when we throw things, that is, matter, through two slits, we get this, two bands of hits. And with waves, we get an interference pattern of many bands. Good so far. Now, let's go quantum. An electron is a tiny, tiny bit of matter, like a tiny marble. Let's fire a stream through one slit. It behaves just like the marble, a single band. So, if we shoot these tiny bits through two slits, we should get, like the marbles, two bands. What? An interference pattern. We fired electrons, tiny bits of matter through. But we get a pattern like waves, not like little marbles. How? How could pieces of matter create an interference pattern like a wave? It doesn't make sense. But physicists are clever. They thought, maybe those little balls are bouncing off each other and creating that pattern. So, they decide to shoot electrons through one at a time. There is no way they could interfere with each other. But after an hour of this, the same interference pattern is seen to emerge. The conclusion is inescapable. The single electron leaves as a particle, becomes a wave of potentials, goes through both slits, and interferes with itself to hit the wall like a particle. But mathematically, it's even stranger. It goes through both slits and it goes through neither. And it goes through just one and it goes through just the other. All of these possibilities are in superposition with each other. But physicists were completely baffled by this. So they decided to peek and see which slit it actually goes through. They put a measuring device by one slit to see which one it went through and let it fly. But the quantum world is far more mysterious than they could have imagined. When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of two bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently, as though it was aware it was being watched. And it was here that physicists stepped forever into the strange, never world of quantum events. What is matter? Marbles or waves? And waves of what? And what does an observer have to do with any of this? The observer collapsed the wave function simply by observing.
Now, the reason that I showed that animation, the animated video, is because that particular subject is the double slit experiment is somewhat difficult to explain without visuals. And what it was explaining was mind over matter. In the concept that it was the observer which influenced whether or not the marble or the matter was in the form of a pulse, which was a little marble, that's a pulse, which they set through individually, or a wave, simply by the observance of the activity. Okay, so with that concept being more difficult to explain, I thought that an animation might serve the purpose of helping those who might, through a verbal explanation only, not be able to understand it as well as they would with a video presentation, the animated video. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the metaphysical aspects of events, and that is relative also to waves, because waves, as we had said in the previous first part of this More Talk chapter 12, was also what determined when reality occurs. When we talked about the collapsing waves of probability, the probability wave collapse. Remember, we said that when you approach that particular filament or strip of time, that delta t, that it does not collapse into reality until you are at that point in the timeline. And as to whether or not it collapses or not is determined by your free will. Okay? So I'm going to ask you to consider the following. In this virtual reality, this perceived reality, one of the most important things to remember is that things are not always as you appear them to be, or as you believe them to be. Right? What affects the cause and effect of what occurs is not always what you believe it to be. Now, for part of the illustration regarding how reality manifests itself and comes to fruition, I'm going to use a subject that everyone is familiar with, 9/11. All right, this is a metaphysical aspect of 9/11. I'm going to start like this. Picture in your mind, if you will, someone pointing a gun, a handgun, at a mother's child. Well, if someone were to be pointing a gun at a mother's child, any mother in their right mind would do whatever they could within their ability immediately, without even thinking about it, to put themselves in between harm's way and their child. they would protect their baby without even thinking about it. There would be no time for fear or anything. The only thing that the mother is thinking about is protecting her child. So she'll move immediately to protect that baby. Now, I need to explain something called wave viscosity. Okay? If you look at a wave, you're going to have what they call troughs and peaks. Troughs and peaks. Okay? A wave that is very slow in its oscillation is the movement of the troughs and the peaks. Just like a wave that you see on the top of, water. That's the water oscillating. If the peak is very high and the trough is very low, then that indicates that it is a viscous or slow energy wave. Now, viscous means thick. Okay? It's very, very slow. An example of an extremely slow energy wave of matter might be molasses running down a tree on a cold winter's day. It appears as if it is solid. Another even better example would be a window pane in an old house. If you go by a very old house, you'll notice that the windows are warped. That's because the glass itself, the silicon, the glass itself, is actually still in a fluid dripping motion, but extremely slow. That's why it's thinner at the top and thicker at the bottom, giving it that warped appearance, and in fact, that state of being warped or thinner at the top than it is at the bottom. So the glass is still in a fluid state, but to the extent that it appears to us solid because of how very small increments of time its flow is. The fewer and fewer and fewer amounts of delta t's, increments of time. You'd have to wait a long time. You have to wait decades upon decades upon decades to see the effect of that viscosity, that thickness. Okay, but it is still nevertheless in a fluid state. An example of a very fast wave would be not the high and low troughs or the high peaks, but let's think about a laser beam, almost a straight line. Okay, light, intense laser beam. Okay, slice through wrought iron just like a hot knife through butter, almost no resistance whatsoever.
Laser cutting is suitable for almost all materials, such as metal, plastics, wood, cardboard, and even ceramics. Laser cutting of metals is a fusion cutting procedure. This means that the energy causes the material to melt, and an inert gas, or at least nitrogen, forces the melt out of the gap. This process achieves smooth, shiny edges and clean cuts with almost all metals, including aluminium, titanium, copper materials, nickel, tungsten, molybdenum, and cobalt.
All right, so on one end of the spectrum, you have a wave that is very slow or viscous, and on the other end, light, you have a very intense, fast, and rapid wave. Okay. So, when you are thinking about love and fear, those are polar opposites, polarities, one end and the other end. Love is a very intense wave. Fear is a very slow and viscosity. Okay? You've heard people say before, someone was petrified in their fear. They were frozen in their fear. These are all analogies that describe very well the nature of the viscosity of that emotion, energy in motion. Fear is a very, very, very slow dimension. I say dimension because all is mind. A state, a condition of the mind. Whereas love is just the opposite. So when you are asking someone the question, what is the difference between, what is the opposite of love? Well, they might say hate. That's what the normal person would say. The opposite of love is hate. And the opposite of hate is love. It's not so. The opposite of love is fear. And the opposite of fear is love. Okay? Now, let's take 9/11. During that event, when they were taking their drone planes, and believe me, there weren't individuals in those planes. The plane that may have left Washington, D.C., matter of fact, it had my sons, both of my sons, teacher on it. She was taking them to a group of kids to Europe on a field trip. Children from the so-called inner city that hadn't even ever left Washington, D.C. Lovely woman from Uganda. And she was taking them on a field trip. When that plane left, we don't know where they went, but they certainly did not circle back around and fly into the Pentagon. If they had, if that had occurred, I don't know if you've ever flown into Washington, D.C., but you literally have to do like this and do a loop-de-loop to fly into the Pentagon, because when you're taking off, you can literally look out of your window directly down on the Pentagon. And none of the light poles or anything were destroyed by a plane coming in. They were still standing. Go back and look at the videos and the rest. But there's a lot of things we could get into relative to how another projectile hit that opposed to an airplane. The hole was too small for a plane and all other types of things. Go to a place called Pilots for 9/11. These particular pilots that have been in the business as professionals for 40, 50 years explain a lot about that, as well as the other maneuvers. Let's just go ahead for this purpose, is recognize those. We're drones there at the Pentagon, as well as at, as well as in New York, the capital, the Empire State. Okay. All right. So back to our analogies. The 9/11 event occurring created a situation in which the hive mind, the collective consciousness of almost every individual on this planet was focused on that one event, on that hollow ground there at the location in the place we now call New York, okay, the Empire State. And that collective consciousness, in other words, every individual, what I call consciousness capsule. We are individualized capsules of consciousness, fractals of the greater all. Each individual focusing, be it by radio or by phone, TV, whatever you were viewing this thing, this event on, everyone was viewing it with intense horror, fear for the loved ones, fear for the people there, the empathy, the sympathy, the sadness, the horrificness of it, the horror of that event. Consciously, all the collective individual minds would be the hive mind of man's consciousness here on this planet. We're all focused on this one centralized event. That horror, that fear, these are very slow and viscous waves, petrified in our consciousness. Focused on that one event of what was occurring. Thousands of people jumping out of windows and buildings falling that were never even hit by anything, and things of this nature. And if you go and you read this document called the New American Century, you'll see that they had even talked about flying drones into buildings to create a situation in which the collective minds of people, individuals in this country would go with that USA, go into that mindset that would, they said that they needed to create another Pearl Harbor-like event, which basically means being attacked on our own soil, to whip people up into a frenzy, to gin them up, okay? So that they would be able to make that footprint in what they call the Middle East. Okay. As well as reset a thing called the clock of destiny. Okay, if you take a vector, okay, a vector would be like a B, like a V. Okay, let's look at a vector. Okay. If you take a V, let's go ahead and do that, and put a straight line through the V. Here's the V, and you put a straight line through it. The straight line represents time, delta T's, time going forward. The vector, left and right vectors, show the arc and angle of what time would take if not on its straight, unchanged course. And as you can see, the further and further away those angles going outwards of time, distance in time, get, the further they are away from where you would have been if an event had not occurred. Because the events on that particular timeline, those realities are not collapsing, but other realities are coming to fruition through the collapsing of the probability waves. on the other timeline, the alternate timeline that has been changed in its vector from what would have transpired. And if you have an event that was supposed to have occurred, like a broadening of consciousness of the hive mind of humanity, let's say it's somewhere like here on the timeline, that event is now, because of what occurred, the event such as 9/11, throwing off the vector, is what we would call a alteration in the clock of destiny. Now, I've been telling people, if you go back and watch some of the older Moor talks, I've been saying for years and years and years that right now, this period that we're in right now, this COVID period, that there would be an uplifting of the consciousness. I'm not talking about the uplifting of fallen humanity as of yet, but I'm talking about a broadening of the hive mind of the collective consciousness was to be occurring. Now, we see a lot of broadening of perspectives right now that came about because of certain events on television of our brothers and children being killed, and that being witnessed by others who might be empathetic to it, at least 45% of the populace that are marching along with those that have created their movement called Black Lives Matter. There's been a broadening of consciousness, awareness of what has always been occurring to us by another sector of society. But the broadening of awareness and consciousness that I'm talking about, which would have occurred in a blink of an eye, was an evolution of man's consciousness, a natural evolution. The next evolution of man's consciousness was not going to be growing another digit, finger or something, or a biological evolution in that manner. It was going to be an evolution of consciousness and understanding and evolving into a greater state of compassion and love. In other words, our wavelengths were going to speed up, become less viscous. But the reason that the 9/11 metaphysical event occurred, when I say metaphysical, is because it falls out of the realm of the average person's conscious understandings, in that what occurred was, by everyone viewing that, the collective consciousness of all individuals viewing the hive mind in terror and fear, being petrified in that moment with the horrificness of that event, slowing down the consciousness of the hive collective mind of mankind. They were thrusting us, like those vectors, one or two decimal points left or right, angularly, thrusting us into an era of terrorism, in which our minds were made not higher in consciousness, but slower and lower towards the other polarity of fear and terrorism, slowing down our consciousnesses. And the purpose of that is that there are those and particular entities and energies which cannot exist in the light of love, in that dimensional state. As I said, that's a dimension. And knowing that they could not exist or do the things that they have been doing or wish to do, they would not be successful to do those things that they may wish to do or even exist within that energy of love and higher state of consciousness. Self-preservation. So getting back to the original thing of the mother with the gun being pointed at the mother's child, she immediately jumps in front of her child to protect her baby, to put herself in between harm's way and her child. Even if she had a moment to think about it, she wouldn't hesitate, because the mother's energy oscillates. There's an oscillation in her frequency in which she dynamically, we're not talking about the physical body, we're talking about the actual energy of the spirit person, the more actual person, not the objective reality, okay? But the subjective reality of that individual consciousness capsule, the mother, oscillates into another dimension, which is love. See, love is not an emotion. It is energy in motion, but it's not a feeling. It is a dimensional state of consciousness. So that's a situation where the mother has now oscillated into a dimensional state of consciousness in which fear cannot exist. So, my explanation regarding the events of 9/11 and how that thrust us into an era of terrorism and changed events that would happen in the future. And of course, those are kept intact by, the creation of other type of, departmental things, such as Homeland Security and, police, Gestapo, no-knock warrants, and all types of things that are going on. Not just in this municipality and region, what they call the United States, but globally. This fear-based era in which we have been thrust into is one in which individuals are being more controlled or more malleable and controllable because of the fear factors, the cause and effect of events and situational circumstances. Okay. So always keep in mind that things are not always as they appear to be. And many of those things are metaphysical in nature. All right. So I wanted to talk there a moment about wavelengths and energies in a couple different ways, and remembering the occurrence of what transpired in the animated cartoon that we took a look at. These are all factors relative to our virtual reality or perceived reality or objective reality, which is that which comes out of or is birthed out of or comes into fruition from the subjective real reality. Now, for those of you that may not have seen the first part of this particular More Talk episode 12, I think it's entitled Adept Lesson 1. View that and then come back and view this again. It might even make more sense to you. Okay, I'm certain that it will. So let's take a look at a couple other things that are very important, because all of this ties together. Okay. Okay, so just as a recap, we looked at first what we know, okay, our perceived objective reality, where objects exist. We looked at then the cornerstone of our base reality, the superset, which is consciousness, our subjective reality. That's the cornerstone. And that our spirit person, the energy, the individualized consciousness capsules, possessing a gift of free will to, through this free will, metaphysically manifest our own destiny, operating within a perceived multiplayer virtual reality, which, like any virtual reality, is very similar in nature to a computer simulation environment, possessing its own operational rule sets. A binary digital virtual reality system, infinitely more sophisticated than any computer system, unfathomable in its complexity than is even perceivable by the finite human mind. Ours, in this objective reality, can be expressed within terms of relativity, like the theory of relativity, that equation, E equals mc squared. Okay. However, Einstein only came close to getting it right because he started his formulations of his theory of relativity from within the subset objective reality. He never got outside of the box or subset to view our perceived existence from that perspective outside of which it was manifested or derived. You have to view it from its superset, from the base reality, consciousness. E equals mc squared is a formula which may explain certain aspects of our perceived illusionary physical reality. However, to understand one's potential optimal functionality of the spirit being's superset-based reality, out of which the illusions are derived, you must use the formula LTFJ, which of course is love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice. Now, Einstein was correct, however, when he stated in his last press conference that reality is merely an illusion, albeit a very persistent one. Because our perceived objective reality is the fear-based illusion fueling the baked-in trauma-causing social mechanisms, like the heretofore accepted generational terrorism, like systemic racism, that Trump's Attorney General Barr the other day said does not exist, even though he knows that in fact it does. But that's immaterial, because we'll always have evil trying to convince us that it does not exist. So we looked at how the opposite of love is not hate, but is fear. How the opposite of that extremely orderly and intense, like a laser beam, high entropy dimension, love, is not hate, but is instead an extremely slow and low, viscous, frozen entropy state of mind we know as fear. So now we're going to be looking at the most important thing, our purpose, goal, and objective. The reason why we exist. Biggest question involved. We're going to define that very specific within terms that use a great deal of specificity so that we can understand, refer to this particular presentation for anyone who may be wondering still why we're here, what are we supposed to be doing, what are we supposed to be accomplishing with our lives, and how can we begin the process of not just doing things like reanimating our Moorish community's body politic, but first, how can we lower our individual state of confusion, okay, by raising our consciousness, which is love. That's why the prophet said, teach your children to love instead of hate. But you have to understand what love is. It's not just a feeling or an emotion. It is actually a dimensional state in which energies exist and operate at their most optimum level of functionality.